Week 16 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defense DST units I looked at this week. The first one, the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans actually came out and played a solid ball game, but losing towards the end at the Los Angeles Chargers in Week 15. So this Titan unit, the last few weeks, hasn't been great at all, except that Charger game. But they are 1 week use only with a great matchup in Week 16 versus the Texans. I give up the third most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few games here for Tennessee: Week 12 versus Cincinnati, 20 points allowed, a sack. Week 13 at Philly, 35 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 14 versus Jacksonville, 36 points allowed. And Week 15 at the Chargers, like I said, played a solid game, 17 points allowed to that offense, 3 sacks and 2 windows. So as a 1 week use only versus Houston, this is a great matchup this week here. And this Titan defense available in 53% of fantasy leagues. The next defense is the Cleveland Browns. So this Brown defense, I know it hasn't been a good year for them, but it's a pretty good matchup versus the New Orleans Saints. And they're 1 week only use as well. I know the Saints came off a good victory, but that was the Atlanta Falcons. And this Brown defense, they played a great game versus the Baltimore Ravens in Week 15. So the last few games for this defense, they've had some good ones. Week 13 in Houston, 12 points allowed, 2 windows, 2 fumble recoveries, 2 touchdowns, and return touchdown. Week 14 at Cincinnati, 23 points allowed, 2 sacks and into. And Week 15 versus Baltimore, 3 points allowed only, 3 sacks and into, a fumble recovery and a block kick. So right now the Saints give up the 6th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. And the Browns right now available in 75% of fantasy leagues. The next defense is the Detroit Lions. So this Lion team, they're playing with fire and desire. And that stems from the head coach believing his guys and talking confidence into them. And this defense, even over the last few weeks, has held their own for the most part. Week 13 versus Jacksonville, 14 points allowed, 2 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 14 versus Minnesota, 23 points allowed, 4 sacks, 2 fumble recoveries. And Week 15 at the Jets, a good ball game, 17 points allowed, 4 sacks, an into, and a Khalif Raymond punt return touchdown. So right now, with a good matchup coming up Week 16 at the Panthers, where their offense really isn't all that dynamic and doesn't have that great big playability of late. This Detroit Lions defense available right now in 96% of fantasy leagues. The next DST is the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the Jaguars, they've been playing good football over the last few weeks here, and a nice comeback victory, beating the Cowboys as well, is this Jaguar team, ending on a pick 6, believe it or not, in Week 15. So the last few weeks here for this Jacksonville DST unit, not the greatest of games, but 2 in a row now. They put up some numbers. Week 12 versus Baltimore, 27 points allowed, a sack, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 13 at Detroit, got the doors blown off, 40 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 14 at the Titans, 22 points allowed, 4 sacks and into 3 fumble recoveries. And Week 15 versus the Cowboys, 34 points allowed, but 3 sacks, 2 windows, and the Jenkins pick 6 to end it. So right now, with a good matchup at the New York Jets in Week 16, especially if Zach Wilson starting in that game, which we don't know for sure. Even though he did play a decent game, I still think this Jaguar defense can make a few plays on him, and they're available right now 93% of fantasy leagues. In the 5th and final defense DST unit I look to get off the wire this week here is the Los Angeles Chargers. So the Chargers here, 1 week only use, even though they had a pretty good ball game versus the Tennessee Titans. Even though if you stop Derrick Henry, you pretty much stop 70% of that offense. But anyway, good matchup coming up in Week 16 here for this Los Angeles Charger team at the Indianapolis Colts. That obviously are a train wreck, coming off that 33-0 blown lead and losing the ball game and giving up the most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. I think the Chargers could take advantage on Monday Night Football. Week 14 versus Miami, 17 points allowed, 2 sacks. And Week 15 versus Tennessee in that one, 14 points allowed, 4 sacks, and an into. So right now, this Charger team available in tons of fantasy leagues in 76%. And as a 1 week only use versus a weak offensive line over there in Indianapolis and a turnover machine, I definitely would give them an ad this week. So that's a few defense DST units I look to add off the waiver wire here for Week 16 of the fantasy football season.